That scuba diver looks like he's about to walk right off the stage. Super grateful for the children's ministry team, the great work they've been doing to prepare for 200 kids showing up this week, over 100 volunteers. It is probably the most important week of the year. The opportunity that we have to disciple young people in the faith is extraordinary. So thanks for being a part of it. Everybody who's serving, of course, giving to the church enables us to be able to do this. So we're really excited about this coming week. Hey, we just finished singing a song that had this great line in it that goes like this. When he shall come with trumpet sound, speaking of the return of Christ when Jesus comes back, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. And that is a great truth, isn't it? That I am made righteous because of what he has done for me. Not because of my performance, but because of his performance. That when I stand before Christ, I am made new, I am forgiven, I am restored, I am dressed in his righteousness. And that's something that we celebrate all the time around here. Hopefully we will celebrate several kids this week making a declaration of faith for the first time, and then maybe we'll even get to see them baptized on August 4th. But the question that I want to deal with today is, since this is true, and since we celebrate this all the time, why should I do good works? In other words, if Christ has saved me, why should I follow Christ? Right? What is the whole purpose behind following Jesus? What's the purpose behind doing good works? Now, we could spend some time coming up with several different reasons as to why we should do good works. I think maybe one of the reasons that we come up with, and I've certainly heard this reason from some people, is they'll say, well, I do good works to ensure my salvation. In other words, yeah, I kind of believe that it's the cross alone, but I kind of need to be a good person as well. You'll hear that sometimes. And the reason I don't like that response is because how do you know if good is good enough? Or what if you get saved or meet Christ when you're 85 years old and you're thinking to yourself, well, I only have maybe a few years left. Do I have enough time to make up for all of the years that I didn't do good work? So this statement that I do good works to ensure my salvation eventually breaks down at one point because we're never told how good is good enough. Another reason that we might give in terms of why we should do good works is, well, we should do it as an overflow. Right? In other words, we should be so moved by the goodness and the greatness of Christ in our lives that it should just spring out of us, right? That it should kind of be an overflow because God has been so good to us. And I think that's an ideal situation, that you would wake up every morning and you would be so moved by the goodness of God that it just flows out of you. But that's not our daily experience, right? I mean, there are moments where we don't really feel the overflow, but we're still called to do good works. I mean, imagine me telling my wife one day, hey, I don't think I'm going to serve the kids today because I don't feel the overflow, right? She would say, you need to get over yourself, right? Because sometimes you just got to serve even when you're not feeling it. So I don't always like that response as well. So I would submit to you that there are maybe a couple of main reasons as to why we do good works. The first one is because we were created and commanded to do good works. And maybe the best verse that illustrates this is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, where Paul writes, for you are saved by grace. And this is not of yourselves, it is through faith, so that no man may boast. It is the gift of God, right? It is a gift. You can't earn it. Then the very next verse, in verse 9, says, for you were created to do good works. You are Christ's workmanship. Right? So we're created to do good works and we're commanded to do good works. Jesus would say, I command you to love one another. The Apostle Paul would say, I command you to be rich in good deeds and be generous and willing to share. So we're commanded to do it and we're created to do it. One of the reasons that we enjoy serving other people is because that's the image of God in you, right? We have a whole group of people who are going on a mission trip August 10th. There's a bunch of high school kids, and they did a car wash, and they went out in the hot sun and served for like 4 hours washing cars so that they could raise money to go on a trip and work. Now, who would do such a thing, right? It's because we were created to work. And most of you would say, yeah, when I serve other people, it feels good. It feels like I'm accomplishing a purpose. So the first reason is because we were created to do good works, and Jesus commanded us to do good works. But today I want to talk about one of the reasons that we may not think about very often. This is all over the New Testament, and it's something we don't talk about very often, but I think it is something that is very, very apt to talk about as we finish off this series that we've been going through over the past couple months called By Faith. And this entire series, if you haven't been here, could be summed up like this, that we are called, if you're a Jesus follower, to take steps of faith, right? Everything in the past is the known. It's our history. And oftentimes God calls us to take a step of faith. And those steps of faith could be fearful. It could be steps of faith that are into the unknown. But there's always a reward when it comes to saying yes to God. And the author of Hebrews lists all of these people that did this: Abel and Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and Rahab. This is known as the Hall of Faith, the cloud of witnesses, the people who went before us to lay down the foundation. And the author of Hebrews goes on in chapter 11, and he says, "And what more shall I say?" I could go on and on about all of the heroes of the faith that took steps of faith to prepare the way for you and I to take steps of faith. He would say, I don't have time to tell you about Gideon and Barak and Samson. If you were here last week, Isaac talked about Samson. If you weren't here, I would recommend that you go back and listen to that really inspiring message on Samson. He goes on, he talks about Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. So there are moments in your life when you say yes to God that you get an immediate blessing. You get immediate fulfillment of a promise. There are times in your life where God says, I want you to take a step of faith. And you'll get a blessing immediately. It might be you might finally meet your knight in shining armor. You might meet the girl or the woman of your dreams. You might get a promotion, right? You might get a financial breakthrough. You might get a new job. Things may go well with you if you say yes to God immediately. We see this with the life of Gideon, right? We discover his story in Judges chapter 6, where one day Gideon's this young man and he's hanging out in a wine press or in a basement because he's terrified of the Midianites who have overtaken the land. And an angel of the Lord comes up to Gideon and says, Gideon, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And Gideon's like, my paraphrase, no, he's not. I mean, we're being overrun by the Midianites. I don't see any signs of the goodness of God. And so God says, okay, I'm going to do a miracle through you. I just need you to take a step of faith. So here's what you need to do, Gideon. You need to lead the army, and I'm going to give the Midianites into your hands. And Gideon's like, yeah, but, again, this is my paraphrase. Gideon's like, yeah, but we only got 32,000 Israelites, and they got 135,000 warriors. I don't like the odds of that. And God's like, I don't like the odds of that either. I'm actually going to whittle your army down to 300 men. And Gideon's like, what? 300 men against? And God's like, the reason I want you to only go out there with 300 men is because if you defeat them with 35,000 or 32,000, then you're going to think that you did it. But I want to demonstrate my power among you, that it is through me that you're going to get the victory. And so you read the account in Judges 6 and 7, and Gideon, he's like, all right. So he's got 300 men. You know, he's got his torches. And they take the hill, and the Midianites just turn on each other, and God gives him the victory. So we see that Gideon becomes a national hero. He becomes popular. Everyone's like, wow, he's our man, because he took a step of faith. All that to say is sometimes when you take a step of faith, God blesses you immediately, and you get immediate blessings. He goes on and he says this, there's people who took steps of faith and God shut the mouths of the lions. The story of Daniel, who's like, no, I'm going to pray to God even though it's against the law. And God sends Daniel into the lion's den, and God shuts the mouth of the lions, and Daniel becomes famous, and he gets a promotion. Or the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who get thrown into the fiery furnace because they refuse to bow down to the golden statue. And they don't get singed with any of the flames. God preserves them. Immediate blessing, they get a promotion, and we talk about the greatness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and he became powerful in battle and routed foreign enemies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. So when God says go, you do it. When God says take a step of faith, you say yes, and you leave the results with him. And sometimes you're going to get an immediate blessing, just like Gideon, just like Daniel, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And sometimes you might take a step of faith and you might get tortured. And some of these people endured torture and they refused to be released. So some of you this week, you're going to serve a summer blast, right? I can guarantee you two things. Number one, there will be a reward. And number two, at some point this week, you will experience torture, right? All of you who work with children know exactly what I'm talking about, that there are moments where you're with a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or even a 6th grade animal, and you're experiencing torture. There will be moments where you're like, I should have just stayed at home today, right? But you took a step of faith. You experienced the hardship of investing in children, and you're going to be blessed for that. So sometimes it works out. Sometimes you get tortured. It's a great story about a man named Polycarp. Jesus had 12 disciples. One of his most popular disciples was the Apostle John, who wrote the book of John, who wrote the book of Revelation. Well, John had a disciple, and his name was Polycarp. Polycarp became the leader of an early church in Smyrna. And one day the Roman authorities came up to Polycarp and they said, we want you to bow your knee to Caesar. All you need to do is say Caesar is Lord instead of saying Jesus is Lord. And you know what Polycarp said? He said, for 86 years I've been his servant, Christ's servant. And he has done me no wrong. And how can I now blaspheme my king who saved me? And they're like, you sure? Like, because we're going to light you on fire. And he's like, you read the story, he's like, I'll burn for an hour, but I don't want to burn for eternity. So they light him on fire. And the story's incredible. They light him on fire. I don't know how many people are watching, but the flames come up and they don't even touch him. And we're like, wow. Probably people are thinking, that's just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where the flames came up and they didn't destroy him. But then, you know what happens? One of the soldiers pulls out his sword and kills Polycarp. Sometimes you say yes to God and you escape the sword. Sometimes you say yes to God and you get tortured for the faith. The author of Hebrews would describe it like this. He would say, others were tortured and they refused to be released so that they might gain a ... Now, the next part of this statement is so profound, and when I originally read it, I thought to myself, this is where I need to go with the rest of the sermon because it's so powerful, but it's a little bit confusing. So let me see if I can explain this. Here's what the author of Hebrews states: that they might gain a better resurrection. Now, I gave this sermon to somebody recently. And when I said that if you choose to follow Jesus, sometimes you might get a promotion and sometimes you might get tortured, but you'll always gain a better resurrection. This person said, what on earth does that mean, to gain a better resurrection? And I said, I'm so glad you asked. So let me explain what it means to gain a better resurrection, okay? Here's what we believe. We believe that one day Jesus is going to come back, and when he comes back, I'll be found in him when you receive Christ, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. And the timing of how all of this is going to take place is a bit debatable. But eventually, after Jesus comes back, he's going to set up the new heavens and the new earth. He's going to renew this earth. So this earth is our final resting place. Right? This is our final destination. And at some point, there is going to be a second judgment. I like to think of it in terms of a second judgment. And here's how Jesus would describe it. He would say this: For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. So in this second judgment, there will be a rewarding for how you spent your days on earth. Here's how Paul would describe it in 2 Corinthians 5. He would say, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad." So there's going to be a moment where you're going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and he's going to give you rewards based on how you lived this life. And maybe one of the most convicting verses, one of the most convicting things that Jesus says is there's also going to be a reckoning. Here's how he described it. "I tell you that men will have to give account on that day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken." Whew, that's pretty convicting. Jesus would give parables to talk about this moment before standing before the throne of Christ where he gives you your rewards. And here's the parable that he would give. He would describe it like this. "Again, it," meaning the kingdom of heaven, "will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his property to them." So the meaning of the parable is that God gives us a certain amount of resources, time, talents to steward on behalf of him. To one, he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. So here's what's interesting. In this parable, the word talent refers to a sum of money. And that was the original meaning of the word talent, a sum of money. But then hundreds of years later, they switched the meaning to it to ability. So now when you hear the word talent, you think about ability. That's from this parable. So the guy who gets the first 5 talents goes out and he invests the 5 talents, and he does really well, and he gets an additional 5 talents. The guy who gets the 2 talents goes out and he invests the 2 talents, and he gets an additional 2 talents. And then the guy who gets the 1 talent ends up burying it in the ground. Jesus continues the parable, and he says, "After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them." Meaning, at one point, Jesus is going to come back and he's going to settle his accounts with us. Essentially saying, how did you do with the talents that I gave you? Right? And the guy with the 5 talents says, "Hey, you gave me 5 talents. Thank you so much for the resources. I invested them and I got 5 more. And the guy who had the 2 talents says, "Hey, you gave me 2 talents. I went out and I invested it and you gave me 2 more. And God's going to look at us. God's going to look at the people who invest their talents wisely, and he's going to say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things, and so I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness." In other words, you did such a good job of stewarding the resources that I gave you. Come into the new heavens and new earth, and you will gain rewards, and those rewards are a higher capacity to serve God. I like to say it like this, that in the new earth, this final resting place, we will not be rewarded based on our ability, but rather on our responsibility. This is a really important point. We need to stop comparing each other with each other. Stop comparing yourself to other people, because you're not going to be held accountable according to comparing yourself to me. And I'm not going to be held accountable to what you were entrusted to. See, each and every one of us was given a certain amount of talent. And when we stand before Christ, you're going to be rewarded not according to your ability, but according to your responsibility. Here's how Randy Alcorn described this in his super helpful book called Heaven. He writes this: "Service is a reward, not a punishment. We think that faithful work should be rewarded by a vacation for the rest of our lives." Isn't it true that vacation is only good for like a certain period of time, and then after a while you feel like you need to produce something? I was talking with a friend of mine recently. I went on his work site. He's a construction worker. And he's told me, he said, I never go on vacation because I love my work so much and I just want to keep on working. And part of me was like, well, I kind of feel sorry for you because I think you should probably take a vacation. But the other part of me was inspired by that this guy loves his work so much that he wants to keep producing and making a difference in people's lives. And this idea that when we get to heaven that we're just going to sit around on clouds all day and sing songs to the Lord, that is not a biblical idea. The New Testament is clear that when we get to the next life, that you're actually going to have things to accomplish, right? He says the rest of our lives, but God offers us something very different indeed. Here's what he offers us. Here's what our reward is in the next life. More work, more responsibilities, increased opportunities, along with greater abilities, resources, wisdom, and empowerment. We will have sharp minds, strong bodies, clear purpose, and unabated joy. Because in the new heavens and the new earth, which lasts forever, right? We get this small slice of history right now, just a few years. And as we learned yesterday with the assassination attempt, life is quick and it could end at any moment. But eternity, the new heavens and the new earth, it goes on forever and ever and ever. And we will be held account for how we use God's resources in this life. And when we use them well, none of us is going to use them perfectly. But when we use them well, we will be rewarded with all of this. Here's your reward, friends, for serving Christ. The more we serve Christ now, the greater our capacity will be to serve him in heaven. So here's the hard part of the parable. Is the man who got the 1 talent and buried into the ground appeared before his master. And here's how Jesus described it. Then the man who had received the 1 talent came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man. So I was afraid. And I went out and I hid your talent in the ground. And if you read the rest of the parable, it does not go well for that man. See, when you have a skewed view of God, like he's a hard man, and he's just this God up there that's ready to zap me if I mess up, that is not the God that is presented in Scripture, right? This is a God who loves you so much and says, look, I'm gonna ask you to take some steps, and I know it's scary, but do not fear, because I got you. Just take the step of faith and leave the results to me. Now, some of you might be thinking right now, maybe you're watching online, and you're like, okay, I don't have a whole lot of time left, and my body doesn't work very well, so I can't serve the Lord as well as I used to. And I just want to say this, that we have some people in our church who are extraordinary prayer warriors. And did you know that prayer is a work that will be rewarded? Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talked about this. He said, there's people out there that will pray and fast and give to the needy, and their motivations are selfish. They do it so that they'll impress other people, right? There's people that will go out to the street corners and they'll pray to God with these fancy prayers, and they'll fast and they'll start doing this whole thing so that people can say, wow, they're so good at prayer. Wow, they're so impressive at fasting. Wow, did you see how much money they gave to the needy? Jesus says, when you give, you shouldn't even let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. When you pray, you should go into a room and close the door, because your Father, who sees what is done in secret, he'll reward you. So you keep on praying and you keep on serving. And even if you don't see the earthly results, you're going to get a reward. Saying yes to God, it'll always gain you a better resurrection. And the cloud of witnesses that went before us would say, man, it's worth it. It's worth it. The author of Hebrews goes on and he says this, some people who said yes to God, they were tortured, and they faced jeers and flogging while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. I kind of think that's probably the worst way to die, to be sawn in half. Right? They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. And they wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet not one of them received what had been promised. You see, there are all kinds of people that where God said, I want you to take a step of faith. And they took that step, and then they died. They never got to see the results of their faithfulness. Like when Abraham died, all he saw was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now, 4,089 years later, he's got as many descendants as there are stars in the skies, just as God had promised him. God says God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect, or they would be made complete. See, this is really, really cool. That all those heroes of the faith that have gone before us have laid the foundation, and we're building onto the foundation that they started so long ago. And the illustration that the author of Hebrews is using here is a race, right? And if I could kind of end this series dipping into Hebrews chapter 12, which is truly one of my favorite passages in the Bible, where the author says this. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses as these. Right? You're surrounded by Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and David and Jephthah and Samson and all these people who have gone before us. You're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses who are in this room, who are part of this local church. We are surrounded by people who are cheering us on, saying, keep on going after it. Don't grow weary and lose heart. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses such as these, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God the Father. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Don't grow weary and lose heart. If things are going well, praise God. If you feel like you're being tortured, praise God. Keep on taking steps of faith and leave the results with him, because he's working even though we may not be able to see it. And this week at Summer Blast, when you feel like, I'm starting to lose a little bit of energy, I don't even know if this is making a difference. Being faithful, being a person who by faith says yes to God, it always makes a difference. And you might see the blessings immediately, but you will always gain a better resurrection. Because everything we do in this life is building on the next life. Because there will come a day where we all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and we give an account for what we did after we've been dressed in his righteousness alone, after we've been declared righteous and faultless because of what he has done. And then he will say, come on in and enjoy the rewards that I have for you. Amen. All right, at this time, I'm going to invite a friend of mine to come forward. But before she does, I'm going to talk to those of you who are watching online right now. I want to introduce to you our international worker, or some people like the term missionaries. We're trying to go with the word international worker, who became a person by faith, who moved far away to serve God. And for security reasons, we cannot allow this person to be online. So if you're watching online, thank you for being a part of our service today, and we will see you around. God bless you.